Subscribe to The Survival Record if you value long-form historical analysis that focuses on what actually sustained societies under stress, not just what destroyed them. This channel exists for viewers who understand the broad outlines of history and want to examine what was quietly learned, then quietly forgotten. For most people, World War II marks the moment when industrial agriculture proved its necessity. Synthetic fertilizer, mechanized farming, and centralized supply chains are often presented as the only reason modern nations survived total war. That story is incomplete. During the war, several countries were cut off from industrial fertilizer almost overnight. Some collapsed agriculturally, others did not. One of them solved the problem not with chemistry, but with a plant, an old stubborn legume that could rebuild soil fertility without factories, imports, or fuel. It worked. It worked well enough to sustain food production under blockade. And after the war, it was deliberately abandoned. The plant was the lupin. Its disappearance tells us far more about post-war power, economics, and dependency than about botany. To understand why lupins mattered, you have to understand how fragile fertilizer really was in wartime. Before World War II, global agriculture depended on nitrogen sources that were far more vulnerable than most people realize. Chilean nitrate deposits had already shown how geopolitics could strangle fertilizer supply, which is why Germany invested heavily in the Haber-Bosch process during World War I. By the late 1930s, synthetic nitrogen was again central to European food systems, but it was inseparable from fossil fuel access, industrial infrastructure, and uninterrupted logistics. Once war began, fertilizer factories became strategic targets. Fuel shortages crippled production. Transport networks broke down. Imports vanished. In occupied and blockaded regions, soil fertility collapsed within a single growing season. Crop yields fell, not because farmers forgot how to farm, but because nitrogen had become an industrial dependency. Germany understood this problem better than most. Long before Allied bombing campaigns intensified, German agronomists had already begun planning for fertilizer scarcity. Their solution did not come from a laboratory. It came from a plant their grandparents had grown. Lupins were not a miracle crop, but they solved a problem industrial systems could not. Lupins are nitrogen-fixing legumes with unusually deep roots and high biomass. Unlike clover or peas, they thrive in poor, sandy, acidic soils where conventional crops struggle. They require no synthetic fertilizer. Through symbiosis with soil bacteria, they pull nitrogen directly from the atmosphere and lock it into the soil. This was not new knowledge. Lupins had been used in European agriculture since antiquity, particularly in Mediterranean regions. What changed in the 1930s was scale and urgency. German agricultural planners expanded lupin cultivation aggressively, especially in marginal lands previously considered unsuitable for intensive farming. By rotating lupins with cereals and potatoes, farmers could restore nitrogen levels without chemical inputs. Yields stabilized. In some regions they increased, livestock feed improved, soil structure recovered. Most importantly, this system functioned independently of industrial supply chains. During the height of the war, lupins were doing something no fertilizer factory under bombardment could reliably do: regenerate soil year after year. The real wartime advantage of lupins was resilience, not yield. Lupin-based agriculture did not outperform industrial fertilizer in ideal conditions. That was never the point. Its advantage was that it continued working when everything else failed. Lupins required seed, labor, and time, nothing more. They tolerated drought better than many nitrogen-hungry crops. Their deep roots reduced erosion. When plowed under, they functioned as green manure, enriching fields for subsequent food crops. In survival terms, this was not optimization, it was redundancy. This mattered profoundly in a war defined by disruption. When rail lines were destroyed, fertilizer did not arrive, lupins were already in the ground, When fuel was rationed, fertilizer plants shut down. Lupins continued fixing nitrogen. When cities demanded food from exhausted countryside soils, lupin rotations prevented total collapse. German agricultural reports from the early 1940s repeatedly note that regions relying heavily on legume rotations fared better under blockade conditions. This was not ideology. It was empirical observation under stress. After the war, the plant survived. The system did not. When World War II ended, lupins did not suddenly stop working. The soil improvements remained. Farmers knew how to grow them. Seed stocks existed, but within a decade, lupin-based fertility systems had nearly vanished from mainstream European agriculture. This was not accidental. Post-war reconstruction was built around industrial expansion, not resilience. Synthetic fertilizer production surged, fueled by cheap fossil energy and Cold War geopolitics. Nitrogen plants became symbols of modernization. Governments subsidized chemical inputs. Research funding followed industrial priorities. Lupins, by contrast, offered no centralized control. They could not be patented. They did not require massive capital investment. They empowered local farmers to regenerate their own soil fertility without ongoing purchases. From a systems perspective, that was their flaw. The erasure of lupins was economic, not scientific. There was no moment when agronomists concluded lupins were ineffective. Instead, they were reclassified as inefficient. In an economy built around scale, speed, and surplus, a plant that prioritized soil health over immediate yield became inconvenient. Agricultural education shifted away from biological cycles toward chemical inputs. Crop rotations shortened. Monocultures expanded. Fertilizer dependency deepened, not because it was the only option, but because it supported industrial profit models and geopolitical leverage. By the 1960s, nitrogen fertilizer consumption in Europe had reached levels unimaginable during the war. Soil degradation followed quietly. Farmers compensated with more inputs. The cycle locked in. Lupins were not banned. They were simply forgotten. For survival-minded observers, the lesson is not nostalgia. It is systems literacy. Lupins did not save Germany from defeat. They did not prevent hunger everywhere, but they demonstrated something crucial. Soil fertility can be regenerated biologically under extreme conditions without industrial infrastructure. That lesson applies far beyond wartime Europe. Any system that depends entirely on centralized inputs is vulnerable to disruption. World War II exposed this repeatedly. Fuel, food, medicine, fertilizer. In each case, decentralized solutions proved more resilient, even if they were less efficient on paper. Modern survival planning often focuses on tools and stockpiles. The lupin story reminds us that regenerative systems matter more than stored supplies. A warehouse empties. Soil, if managed correctly, renews itself. Remembering these quiet wartime solutions matters because they were tested under real pressure. History tends to preserve what aligns with power, not what works quietly in the background. Lupins never had a lobby. They did not fit the narrative of technological triumph that followed the war, but they kept fields productive when factories failed. For historians, this challenges the assumption that progress is linear and irreversible. For survivalists, it reinforces an older truth. Resilience comes from understanding cycles, not just accumulating resources. If you value uncovering these overlooked lessons learned under conditions far harsher than most modern planning scenarios, subscribe to the Survival Record. And if this kind of deep historical analysis matters to you, share this video with others who want more than surface-level war stories.